Man Who Shot Liberty Valance was the very first John Ford movie I ever saw. I also think it was the first John Wayne movie I ever saw, if we leave television out of the equation. I was 11 years old, and I went by myself, and I went home, and my grandmother asked me if I liked the movie, and I said, yeah, I did. And she said, how come? And I said, I'm not sure. And if you'd held a gun to my head, I couldn't have explained why I liked the movie. But in the manner of a child who recognizes the adults are having a serious conversation that's over your head, and there's something weighty going on here, I was completely held by the movie, even though it doesn't have the things that kids like. It's not particularly violent. It doesn't have a lot of action. What it does have is an attitude of moral weight and seriousness. It's a very sad, emotional movie. At the end, it's really kind of mournful. Ford was growing old. He was 66 or 67 when he shot this, going on about 85. He was a very old 67. He'd been an alcoholic for a half a century. That had caused enormous physical damage to him. His eyesight was beginning to fade. He only had one good eye at this point. So the visual aspect of his films was gradually diminishing from what you can see in movies like The Quiet Man or The Searchers. The Searchers is only 6 years before Liberty Valance. But this is made in an entirely different visual key and emotional key as well. Also, Ford was going through the same things that we all do when we get older. People were dying. People that were quite irreplaceable in his life. People like Ward Bond. People that he'd been very, very close to for 30 and 40 years. And he wasn't adjusting well to this. And the same thing was going on in Jimmy Stewart's life. And Stewart, he exclaimed, well, what am I supposed to do? I haven't made any new friends. You know, all of your friends you've had for 30 or 40 years, you haven't made any new friends. And when those old friends begin to die, it can be very distressing. The business was also changing, which didn't please Ford any. Stars had become much more important than filmmakers. When I was doing my John Ford book, I talked to Howard W. Koch, who was head of production at Paramount at this point. And he told me that John Ford was an important director, he was a major director. He said, but frankly, John Wayne was much more important to that picture getting made than John Ford was. And that was not something John Ford was liable to take lying down. It would have, and he knew it would have known the truth, but it was not a truth he would have been willing to accept at all. John Ford and John Wayne made 18 pictures together, beginning in 1927, 28. And John Ford spent over 40 years essentially rattling John Wayne's cage. The relationship was essentially that of a kind of a crusty, forbidding father figure, with Wayne playing the part of a supplicant child. Adolescent child, and that never really changed because the relationship was set at the point when they met each other. At that point, Wayne was 19 or 20 years old. He was at a summer job at Fox Studios as a laborer. He was on the football team at USC, and he didn't have any money. He was on a football scholarship. And the football scholarship only paid room and board when school was in session, and school wasn't in session during the summer. So he needed a summer job. So the football coach got him a job along with a couple other guys on the team. It was a very good team, by the way, a championship caliber. They won the Rose Bowl in 28. Got him a job as a laborer at Fox, enough to keep body and soul together. And he met Ford, who was already a very important, very powerful director. He'd made The Iron Horse, which a bunch of you saw yesterday, in 1924. This is 1926. The two bonded immediately because, which Wayne had no way of knowing, Ford had been a fullback on his Portland High School football team, which won the state of Maine football championship. And where he was known, he was the fullback, and he was known as Bull Feeney. Feeney because that was his real name, and Bull because that's the way he went into the line. He wasn't a graceful football player, but he was a strong and powerful football player. So the two of them bonded, at first over football, and then over their shared passion for film. Wayne was, as I said, Wayne was constantly being buffeted by Ford. And Wayne was nervous about this film. When I met Wayne many years ago, he would talk about how it was one of those movies where Jack just has all these wonderful character actors and he heaves them against me. You know, he didn't feel he had that much. He felt he was in a reactive position throughout the film. And although one of his famous lines is, "I don't act, I react," he didn't really mean that. He knew he was an actor. But all the character actors like John Carradine and Edmund O'Brien, and for that matter Jimmy Stewart or Woody Strode or Andy Devine, they all had the interesting things to do. And Wayne sort of stood there and was John Wayne. He only had one scene that he really thought was meaningful, which is a scene in a restaurant where he braces Lee Marvin playing the psychotic outlaw Liberty Valance in a performance that could only be described as early Keith Richards. It's a total rock and roll performance, and far more 1960s than 1870s. But I love him, and Ford loved him too. So then one day on the set, Ford happened to mention that he was thinking of cutting the scene in the restaurant and not shooting it. And Wayne was just, "Oh, Jack, you can't cut the scene. That's the only scene I've got in the movie. You can't cut that." "I don't know, Duke. I think we should lose the scene. I think," and even Jimmy Stewart got into it. Well, Jack, Duke needs the scene, Jack. And Ford had no intention of cutting the scene. It's a great scene. He was just jerking Wayne around again, you know. Ford insisted on shooting the movie in black and white. Paramount and Howard Koch wanted it shot in color because in 1962 most movies were being made in color, especially outdoor pictures, even though this is basically shot in the back lot at Paramount. There's only a couple days of production off the Paramount lot. But Ford insisted on black and white. Even Bill Clothier, his cameraman, who worked with Wayne and Ford since Ford Apache 20 years earlier, thought it should be shot in color, but Ford was adamant, and so they gave him what he wanted. They let him shoot it in black and white. At the end of the picture, Ford said, you see, it's better in black and white, isn't it?" And Clothier had to admit it's better in black and white than it would have been in color. What I didn't understand when I was 11 years old, and which I began to understand when I got a little older, like say 50. I wasn't quite that old. What Ford is doing here is deconstructing the myth that he began constructing with the Iron Horse and Stagecoach and films of that ilk. Even The Searchers, in a sense. All the characters start out as slightly larger than life, and at the end of the movie, they're much larger than life. Ethan Edwards in The Searchers becomes this Ahab of the Old West in his pursuit of the Indian chief Scar. They all become much larger than life. In Liberty Valance, beginning with a movie like Fort Apache after the war, all this begins to take place after the war, where he starts to, and I don't know if it was because he saw war so close up that he realized that there's the official narrative of war, and then there's the real narrative, which you don't really see unless you're there, on the spot, in the battle, planning the battle. Then you see the gap between the official narrative and what actually goes on, and how much human error and blunders really figure into things. But beginning after the war with Fort Apache, where he first shows us the ego and the vanity and the bullheadedness and the foolishness that leads to a complete military catastrophe. And at the end, that military catastrophe slowly ascends into myth. You know, here he reverses the process. We begin with the myth. We begin with the characters, all of whom are set. John Wayne is dead as the film opens. He's lying in a pine box. And Jimmy Stewart, Senator Ransom Stoddard, has come back to the town of Shinbone for the burial of an old friend, Tom Donovan. And then we flash back and we see what really happened to the man that shot Liberty Valance. Gallantry is overwhelmed, and gallantry was always a big part of Ford's universe, emotional gallantry. And the myth is dismantled on the way to wonderful irony. The ending of the film, not to get too pretentious, always reminds me of Ozu's Tokyo Story, because it's a dying fall. It's a kind of ending where the character can just say something like, "Isn't life disappointing?" And the whole world is contained in one line of dialogue. I think it's visually ordinary, It's nothing extraordinary in terms of visuals, but thematically, in terms of the density of the script, and in terms of what Ford is saying about the West and America, I think it's a great film. I think it's also a great political film about the accepted narrative of our lives and what really goes on to construct those narratives. Thank you for coming out. I'll enjoy talking more after the film, signing any books if any of you care to buy it. Please enjoy. This film is being shown in 35 millimeter, which is like the most beautiful phrase in the English language. These days, it's such a pleasure for me to see it this way. I haven't seen this picture in 35 millimeter, believe it or not, since 1962. So I'm going to have as much fun as you are. Thank you.